Hello, my name is Erica Brunson Rochette. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an independent consultant focusing on topics such as fostering diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts in the workplace, as well as tapping into personal and organizational leadership at all levels. I am joining you today to talk a little bit about cultural competency and cultural humility, the differences and the intersections of both of these concepts. In this presentation, we are going to cover culture and identity, cultural humility versus cultural competency, how they are different, how they intersect, and how they are layered to work together to help support one another. We're going to look at cultural humility in practice, and we're going to touch just a little bit on cultural humility and how it applies to our library work. This presentation will help you be able to define key concepts of cultural humility and cultural competency and explain the core components, intersections, and differences of both. It will give you an understanding on how these concepts intersect with your own identity and place in the world, and why it's important for us to have this understanding as it applies to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts. You will start identifying ways to build cultural humility into library services and begin to envision ways that cultural humility can improve DEIB efforts in your library. It's important that I note that this presentation is meant as just a starting place. What is shared here is intended as a basic introduction to these concepts and ideas. Continued exploration, learning, and practice around these concepts is vital for implementing them into actionable change. Before we really dive into our presentation today, I want to share one of my favorite quotes by a nice Nin who borrowed this idea from a Jewish religious theology text. And it says, "We do not see things as they are. We see things as we are." And I think that this is a great quote to keep in mind as we really start to dig into how our identities heavily influence our understanding and perception of the world and our place in it. And to do that, we're going to have to really start by wrapping our minds around what we think of when we think of culture. How do you define culture? Here are some very practical definitions that have been pulled from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. And you can see that there are multiple ways that they are looking at what culture is and how culture shows up. But really, this is just meant to show that there are definitions of culture and how we perceive it, how we carry culture with us throughout the world, how we perceive culture in others, and how our identities really come into play that is really multifaceted and layered. That we are all going to have a different idea or perception around what culture is, and to truly understand it, we have to start with ourselves. That being said, on this screen you will see an image of an iceberg. This concept of the cultural iceberg was coined by Edward D. Hall, an American anthropologist and cross-cultural researcher in 1976. Hall suggested that culture is analogous to an iceberg, where only 10% of the identities and culture that we carry with us are visible from the surface, and that the other 90% are less visible or even at times invisible. So things like our communication styles, body language, eye contact, how we perceive time, those are those things that are a little less visible. And then as we get deeper, we're going to look at our attitudes and approaches to things and how that plays a role in how we walk through this world and interact with others. Our attitudes and beliefs towards our elders in our community, attitudes about authority, and the relationships that we have with different people and beliefs in our lives. Really, this is to say that we are all walking through the world with only one small part of our identities that are visible. When we're looking and interacting with others, we're really only seeing the tip of the iceberg with them as well. In doing any kind of cultural humility or empathy work, I always say it's best to start with yourself. To truly understand identity and culture in others, we have to understand it in ourselves. I suggest that everyone take time after this training to really start digging into your own cultural iceberg. What are those parts of your identity that are visible? Which parts are less visible? And then which parts are those really deep and sub-level identities? Those parts of you that are well known, maybe to those that you let into your life or that you share those attitudes and beliefs with. Those are the people who might know that they exist, but to others, they're so deep that they're not visible. And as you're going through this, I feel it's important to say that this is a wonderful starting place, but we do know that this image is static. It is fixed. Whereas culture and identity is ever moving. It's complex, it's dynamic. So please do keep that in mind and know that while this is a great place to start dissecting who you are as an individual, that the idea of culture is not static, and we need to embrace that as something that is very fluid and can't be fully captured by one fixed analogy. So look at those visible, those less visible, and not visible things as you work your way through that exercise. So, what is cultural humility? It is defined as a lifelong process of self reflection and self critique, whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of his or her or their own beliefs in cultural identities. And this concept was coined by Tervelin and Murray Garcia in 1998. They were healthcare professionals that felt that in healthcare there were disparities in the type of care that people were getting, that people weren't receiving appropriate or equal levels of care, many things that we're still seeing in present day. And even in the trainings and workshops and research that these healthcare providers were undergoing, this was not information that they were looking at. It wasn't equitable, and it wasn't really taking into account healthcare as it applies to a collective group of people or those subcultures that exist. And they really wanted to incorporate multiculturalism into their profession and care into the training that they received. So they came up with this idea of cultural humility. When we hear that term, when we think of the word humility, it's defined as having a modest or low view of oneself, to be humble. And while I feel like that can be misconstrued as having low self esteem, or maybe even using humility as a way to say that somebody might not know everything, I think that really taking the idea and instead viewing it as a way of decentering oneself, in fact, actually having that self esteem and the emotional intelligence to know that what one does and what one has and where they're from doesn't necessarily equate to betterness. It's a recognition of self in relation to something bigger. So we're going to build off of that and look at some of those key concepts, those key tenets of cultural humility. And this is building on Tervelin and Murray Garcia's research, but also bringing in some perspective and ideas from Dr. Nicole A. Cook, who is a researcher, librarian, and focuses on critical cultural information studies at the University of South Carolina. And she is an amazing advocate for social justice. The foundation of cultural humility and really finding ways to build it in have been put into three different categories. The first one is lifelong self evaluation, a personal lifelong commitment to self evaluation and self critique. So, getting away from that egocentric way of thinking and really decentering oneself, knowing that your way is one way, but it is not the only way. Recognizing power imbalances. The recognition of power dynamics and power imbalances is huge. And we know that these types of power dynamics show up in all facets of our society, in all of our workplaces, but really having a desire to fix these power imbalances and to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others is key. Then, lastly, is that institutional accountability piece. Holding the library or the policymakers or the people that have the power to make decisions affecting other people accountable for providing inclusive, equitable opportunities, services, and support. But wait, what about cultural competency? I know that we've been talking as a profession about cultural competency for much longer. Maybe some of you came into this training having some understanding of these terms, cultural competency or cultural humility. Maybe you've heard of one of them and not the other, or maybe this is the first time that you're hearing about both. But what is cultural competency and what happened to it? Cultural competency is defined as the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures at all levels. I brought this definition together from both those that who coined the phrase cultural competency, which were Cross, Basra, Dennis, and Isaacs in 1989, and these were mental health care researchers. And I paired it with that ideology of Dr. Nicole Cook and how it really applies to the work that we're doing in libraries. Cultural competency, much like cultural humility, comes from that healthcare profession background. These researchers were looking into the lack of knowledge that was going into the mental health care and how we approach mental health care and the disparities that existed. They wanted to focus on the importance of culture in the health profession and the assessment of cross-cultural relations as a continual expansion of cultural knowledge and the adaptation of services to meet culturally unique needs in the healthcare profession. And Cook took it to that next level and how we can really do that as it applies to how we work with any public facing community or group. Let's look at the main differences between cultural competency and cultural humility. First, cultural competency is a very interpersonal act. It is the act of being. You're trying to be competent, to reach a level of competency or knowledge or a high level of skill. Whereas cultural humility is that kind of intrapersonal work. You're wanting to do something, you're practicing the act of being culturally humble. Cultural competency is learning about others' cultures, identities, and how they show up, really feeling like it kind of assumes there is an expert understanding and it implies that you have the ability to research and study others. So, for example, maybe you have a friend that is from X, Y, and Z country, and you know their habits, you know what they like to eat, you know the sorts of things they like to celebrate. So you might assume that because of that, you know what everyone from X, Y, and Z country likes to do and what's valuable to them. And we know that that can lead to some pretty harmful things, things like stereotyping, making assumptions about people, and even tokenism. When we look at cultural humility, however, it's really the idea of learning with or from others. That kind of reflective approach and knowing that you are committed to continuously learning and listening to others and not starting from a place of assumption to know about others' cultures or things that might be important or valuable to them. Lastly, cultural humility or cultural competency assumes that expertise and that this is something that has an endpoint. To be competent, as dictionary.com defines it, is having the necessary ability, knowledge, or skill to do something successfully. Essentially, a person who is efficient and capable, and it's hard to say that anyone can be knowledgeable or a complete expert on somebody else's culture or identity, right? Whereas when we look at cultural humility, it's really encouraging that lifelong learning and reflective piece, starting from that place of non assumption, listening and learning from others. I really like this quote from Dr. Nicole Cook, who really helps piece these two terms together. Dr. Cook says cultural humility stretches the idea of cultural competence, challenging library staff to not only recognize power imbalances, but to redress these imbalances. So, finding those ways to remedy the imbalances or to set them right. And I feel like it's really important to look at how these concepts play together and really work together for this work, and to not just say we need to eradicate the idea of being culturally competent because it might lead to harm, and instead use it as a foundation to really practice cultural humility. On the screen, I have a graphic from the Project Ready website. Project Ready was an educational project funded by an IMLS grant, a 3-year project, and its primary focus was looking at curriculum and improving relationships with services to and resources for BIPOC youth. And in this graphic, you can see that cultural competence is really that important foundational level to building cultural humility. Really understanding and developing an awareness of one's culture and how it influences your views and interactions with others. And then gaining some base level cultural knowledge about others. So things like what different cultures might celebrate or value, or what strengths might exist in cultures that are different from our own. And then from that, really doing that deeper dive into recognizing where power imbalances are happening and how your own identity and maybe even others' identities are playing into continuing those imbalances. How can we use that understanding to reset or redress how power is being distributed? And then you'll see at the top of this pyramid is that holding systems accountable piece. How can you work at an institutional level to ensure that the systems that you're working within are moving towards greater inclusion and equity and not, in fact, creating more divisions and barriers? So, how do we start cultivating cultural humility? The first tip that I have to share is exploring identity and really looking at that idea of decentering oneself, looking deep inside and starting with you. Taking a moment to lead and interact with others through a lens of empathy and to take perspective, being able to take both a feelings approach and a cognitive mental approach when interacting with other people and observing behaviors. So, thinking, why might they be feeling the way that they are? What has led or added to them having those types of feelings? What different systems might affect people differently and their reactions to them? In doing any kind of DEI work, it's important that we are always willing to learn from our mistakes and missteps and look for opportunities to receive and reflect on feedback. And then knowing what to do with that feedback. So that being really truly reflective. And that's that last piece here is the reflection and self-evaluation piece. And all of these concepts work together. Can you really explore your own identity and decenter yourself without being empathetic and taking perspective of others? Without reflecting on how you're doing that work and how it's showing up? What about how you're taking that feedback and what you're hearing and looking for opportunities to grow and learn? And as we're doing that, we find that there are even more opportunities to remove ourselves from the equation. So it's very easy to see how all these things are working together and really building from one another. I borrowed this next graphic from the Peace Center, and it's just some ideas on how to start really embedding these practices into our everyday understanding of the systems that we are living in and our understanding of how our relationships are working together with others, both societally and in the workplace. And there are some really good tips here on how you can really begin cultivating that cultural humility piece. So, the first tip they have is practice. Practice viewing your own culture as unfamiliar instead of as the norm. So, again, remembering that your way is just one way, but there are multiple ways of moving through this world. The second tip is to listen. Listen with genuine curiosity towards understanding and gaining knowledge about someone else. Be open to adjusting your own way of thinking. Really lean into discomfort. They say that that messiness is where the magic happens. And know that when you're leaning into this discomfort, there will always be times where you may misstep, or maybe you feel like you need to avoid opportunities for growth out of fear or discomfort. But please know that's something that we all have in common. We all have those instances where we don't feel comfortable, or maybe we don't feel like we're the most knowledgeable. But together and collectively, we can learn and we can grow. They say to adopt an attitude of gratitude. I also think that this means really just practice listening for that genuine understanding. Know you are a guest learning someone else's way of life, and by sharing those things with other people and having people share those things with you, that's valuable. And learning about those beliefs and parts of another person's identity that are very, very deeply important to them is a privilege. So really approach getting to know other people as something to be thankful for. Put relationships first. Do things like attempt to learn new languages that are different from your own, mannerisms and customs to connect with people who are different from you. Listen and ask questions. Ask people how you can help celebrate their culture without falling into appropriation. Ask people what ways you can really highlight and amplify their voice or those things that are really important to them so that they feel seen and that they feel like they belong. And then lastly, think about growth and journey not as a goal. Intercultural relationships are not about mastery. They're about genuine connection and seeing the value in one another. So, what does this mean for libraries? It means everything. So, these concepts of cultural competency and cultural humility show up in how we look at our power structures, how we hold ourselves accountable and hold others accountable, and how we get buy in and people on our side. How do we convince stakeholders that there is an initiative or a policy change that we really need their support in? How are our policies, procedures, and systems affecting the people that we serve and the people who are working in our place of work? How are decisions being made? Who is in the room and who is making the decisions? And about which people are those decisions affecting? How is your money being spent? Who and where are you allocating your funds? And who is benefiting from this? Maybe think about what areas are lacking support from your budget. What does your work culture feel like? What does it look like for everyone? Are you really cultivating that feeling of belongingness? Do people feel invested in the work that they're doing? Do they feel seen? Do they feel heard? How are you engaging with community? How are you listening and co designing with your community? And how is community voice showing up in the messages that you're sending out through the work that you're doing and the things that you say you value? All of this is really tied to authenticity. Can someone tell and can someone see that you are not being performative with your actions and that this is something very genuine and authentically important to you? How are you communicating that? You want to make sure that you're not just assuming that your preferred methods of communication are the best way and that you're really being receptive and open to different forms and different types of communication. These are just a few examples of how this shows up in our libraries, but there are so many more. Like I said at the beginning, this is really just the start. There are so many things that feed into our ability to be culturally competent and to practice cultural humility as an ongoing practice. So there are ideas of socialization, the agents and types of socialization, and how each of us was socialized that really play into our understanding of our own culture and how it exists in the world. Recognizing and addressing bias, how bias interrupts cultural humility. There's so much brain science on the ways that our brains are wired that are really tied back to how we were taught, what we were taught, how we were socialized, and all of that comes back to show how bias really appears in our lives. So how can we start to rewire some of that thinking, some of our attitudes and beliefs and assumptions and really tap into feeding into practicing and cultivating that cultural understanding and cultural humility. How do we train our brains and ourselves to take those biases that we've recognized and remove them from the equation? It's also really important to understand that bias is not inherently bad. Bias may often be used as a reason to make people feel like, oh, there's this thing that they have inside of them that is ugly and maybe sometimes shows up as a very mean thing. But truly, bias is one of the things that we all have in common. We all have bias, but it's in recognizing them and what we do with them that truly matters. Understanding and redressing power dynamics. So, this is a big one. We know that power dynamics show up in almost all aspects of the work that we do, in all aspects of society, but really finding ways to have a healthy culture of feedback, ways to call in and knowing when to call in versus when to call out actions, things that you see, things that you have heard. Really building in time to hold yourselves and others accountable for navigating the difficulties that come from those interactions in the workplace, from recognizing when people are being less than culturally sensitive. So, how do we hold folks accountable at different levels of power than ourselves? How to leverage empathy as a tool. We've talked a little bit about empathy and we've talked about taking perspective, but how do we do that? and how can we use that as a benefit in doing cultural humility work? There's a lot of reflection and a lot of continued learning that goes around that. Then, lastly, which really brings in all of these things, is implementing sustainable structures. When we hear things like ongoing work or no endpoint, that can feel really daunting. It might feel like it's impossible or an arduous task, or that it's so overwhelming that we don't even know where to start or how to continue on with that work. But it doesn't have to be. Having a plan in place for committing to the long term and doing some investigating on designing reflection tools that work for different individual needs will really give you a great and powerful starting place in implementing structures that are sustainable and long lasting. So, this was really our very basic introduction to the differences and intersections of cultural competency and cultural humility. If you have questions or inquiries, or if you just want to chat a little bit more, I would love to hear from you. My email is on the screen. And I really do encourage all of you to continue doing that deeper dive into these topics and finding ways that you can support cultivating cultural humility and cultural competency, both in your personal lives and in your workspaces. There are a few additional resources to get started on that deeper dive before you look at other training opportunities, and I've put those on the screen. One of my favorite is the Harvard Implicit Bias Association test that really help you start recognizing some of the biases that you might hold. And once you recognize them, really looking at how you can address them. And then there are some really great cultural competency checklists to see how cultural competency might be showing up or lacking in your workplace. And lastly, I've got my reference and image credit slide. If you want to do any kind of further reading or understanding around some of the researchers or Project Ready or anything else that was discussed or mentioned in this presentation, this is a really great place to start. Again, I thank you and I wish you all the best as you start really practicing and embedding cultural humility and cultural competency into your everyday systems and approaches. Cheers.